Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott.
I'm Jason Rosoff.
And I'm Amy Sandler. Before we jump in, I want to tell you about something really exciting. We now have an ad-free podcast, this very podcast, ad-free, as part of our new Radical Candor community. Go to radicalcandor.com/community podcast and join now. You'll get a 7-day free trial to the Radical Candor community, as well as access to Radical Candor's courses. This podcast you're listening to right now, early and ad-free, you'll get real-time interactive learning opportunities, regular interaction with Radical Candor experts, including Kim and Jason, and so much more. So if you have ever struggled with communication at work, this is your community. Again, that's at radicalcandor.com/community podcast, one word. So today, we are answering a listener's question about how to stop impulsively sharing information that they are supposed to keep private. This person writes, quote, "I need advice on managing confidential information more carefully. I keep accidentally sharing things I shouldn't. Let me explain 2 recent incidents."
I'm going to read one of those incidents. This is not me. This is the listener. I received a message from a team leader about upcoming changes to department SOPs, which I guess is standard operating procedure, in my area of interest. Coincidentally, a colleague messaged me asking if I'd collaborate on proposing new SOPs for the exact same area. I had only quickly skimmed the team leader's message at this point. I responded to my colleague saying I couldn't help due to capacity, but mentioned that the department was already working on incorporating this into new SOPs. Only after that did I fully read the TL's message, which ended with, "This is still a work in progress, so please keep this between us for the time being." I immediately messaged my colleague back, asking them not to share that information. Fortunately, this slip up was relatively minor and I caught it quickly.
All right, incident number 2. This person writes, "Following a recent reorganization, I'm working with my former team lead to wrap up a course project. This morning, I checked their team's group chat to ask about any updates. The team lead informed us that the course was canceled. Since the subject matter experts were expecting to review the course next week, I offered to help communicate this, asking if anyone had a template email I could use. When no one replied, I went ahead and drafted my own email to the subject matter experts, including the phrase, 'Due to a new department direction, the project is canceled.' 3.5 hours later, the team lead responded saying we shouldn't inform the subject matter experts yet and separately requested that I forward her my email. Oops."
The listener shares the concern, quote, "I'm becoming increasingly worried that I might cause serious problems if I can't get better at managing sensitive information. How can I develop better habits around information sharing?" So I thought what we would start to do is look at these 2 incidents as part of a broader picture. And even before we get into the idea of sensitive information, seems to me we might want to talk about just responding to information writ large and the importance of pausing and reflecting before sharing information. So I thought I would check first, Kim, as you read these questions, what popped up for you about some of the habits that this person might be aware or unaware that they are doing in jumping the gun a little bit here?
Well, I mean, you know me, my first instinct was to blame the environment and not the person because I sort of feel like I don't, 2 incidents doesn't make a trend, but in both of these cases, if somebody's working on standard operating procedures and someone else is also working on it, it seems like it ought to be okay for them to be talking to each other. It seems like that shouldn't have been confidential information. That should have been shared information. And in the second incident, the one that Jason read, where you had subject matter experts who are continuing to work on a course that has been canceled, like they should be told immediately that it had been canceled, but rather than being allowed to keep working on it, like it shouldn't be a secret. So I think there's a problem in the organization of excessive secrecy And that's my first that's my blink reaction to this. So but I want to make sure, I want to hear what you all think about that before I give advice about what I have done when there's excessive secrecy.
Thematically similar, but slightly different take. My reaction to it was the person writing has a certain assumption about how freely information should be shared, and with whom, has a certain set of assumptions about that, like a bias towards sharing more, and the organization has a bias towards sharing less.
Yes.
So if we take the value judgment out of which is better or worse, like it's very clear that this person has a bias to sharing information and the organization has a bias to keeping information, let's say, guarded until it is like ready for public consumption. And I've worked in organizations that have operated reasonably well in both of those cases. I will say that your specific example, like the second one, seems pretty damning. Whereas like there's a bunch of people working on something that has been canceled. That is a very like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic kind of feeling to me. Like there's something very sort of disturbing about that like the image that creates.
Yeah. If something is canceled, tell the people who are working on it to stop. Like, what's going on?
Well, it's so interesting hearing, because we haven't really checked in on this beforehand. I will say, we're all, well, I will put myself in here. Kim, I think you are writing yourself in a little bit too. I was aware, as someone has sometimes written things, feeling frustrated that the person didn't read, in Kim, in your example, only after sharing did they fully read the team leader's message, which said, this is still a work in progress. So please keep this between us for the time being. So from my perspective, I think there's a bunch of different things going on. One is, how are we communicating, and are we committing to reading through everything? And so I think this listener, with a lot of self-awareness, acknowledged they only quickly skimmed it, and they were able to deal with it. I think the second one is very interesting, and not only in terms of people are working on something and not wasting their time on that, but I think there's also another assumption here, which is, as a culture, if you haven't gotten a reply from someone, that they were just going to take the ball in their own hands and not do extra work. So I really appreciate that. And it does make me wonder, like, does the culture encourage that? Or are they in a communications culture where people have to kind of sign off on different levels of communication?
Yeah. And I think that's important. I mean, like, I have often gotten feedback that I move too fast. And so slowing down to read the whole email before I take an action on it, I think that is always good advice. Is before you, like, if you get an email informing you of something, before you inform others, like, reread the email before you take
read the
an
whole
action.
thing.
Yeah. And maybe also the stuff below the email as well.
Yeah.
Because there was a really good action to take here, which was instead of telling the other person about it, which was to tell the team lead, I've got this person who's asking me about this thing. Can I put them in touch with you? Because I feel like you should be talking to each other.
Yeah, that probably would have been a better. And I worked at Google for about 6 years before I went to work for Apple. And Google is notoriously open, and Apple is really very secretive, much more secretive culture. And there are some benefits to it. I will say that when I was at Google, I used to get, I don't know, 400 emails a day, maybe 500 some days. And then when I got to Apple, I would get maybe like 3 or 4 emails a day. Like, to the point that I kept checking to make sure the Wi-Fi was working. It's like, what is going on? And once I got used to it, it was really like there was a lot of benefit to, not everybody needed to know everything. And that was a huge relief, actually.
Yep.
And it was just as likely at Google that 2 people would be working on the same thing, because you couldn't keep up with that volume of email.
Yep. In the second incident, like my reaction is, there is the potential like sign off mistake, but if we like go into the actual communication, I think this person framing a decision they didn't fully understand and like communicating that to a whole bunch of other people on behalf of somebody else.
Yeah.
Like that to me, that to me seems like bad. That's just bad form. Like it doesn't matter how much you think you're helping,
Yeah.
but like I'll put it to you this way. If I was working on something that I didn't know was canceled and I received a note that says, due to a change in direction, this has been canceled, and I had not been informed of that change in direction, I had no idea what this person was referring to, like that would be doubly upsetting because I'm like, my team lead didn't inform me. There's some change in direction. And now like conspiracy theories are like popping into my head where I'm like, what is happening here? So I think there's like, there's both the like how you react, like how carefully you sort of like try to absorb the information. And then I think there's a little bit of like thinking about the person on the other side. So both the person who sent you the information as well as the person who's receiving the information, to make sure that like think about how they might receive that. Because I can imagine, based on how this is written, that from this person's perspective, he or she or they would much rather know bluntly and quickly, like, don't work on this thing anymore because it's been canceled. And so they've written themselves into the, you know what I'm saying? They've written themselves into the story a little bit in the way that they respond to it.
And I really appreciate that, Jason, because it's making me think of a recent communication from my my building, the apartment that I live in, where they sent out a text. There were all these fire trucks, and I happened to be, I was home, so I was able to see what was happening and find out. But they sent a text that said, you know, there's been a fire emergency at the building, and you know, it was just like a one-line thing. So if you didn't know what the emergency was, you would sort of be in a bit of a lather, like my dogs, my cat, you know, what's happening there. And so just coming from communication sort of 101 of, you know, this person is probably going to fill in the blanks and probably from a negativity bias. Like, why is the project canceled? Like, what's happening here? And I thought it might be interesting because we as a team, these past few months have been having a bunch of conversations about internal communications. And one of the changes that bubbled up as a result was we started sharing our own individual updates and then reviewing them on a team call. And Jason, I just thought that might be a helpful story to share about like where that came from and what need was being met that maybe this listener might benefit from.
So I think where we're going with this is like, if you take a step back and if this person were to take a step back and try to assess like, what do people actually need from me? Like what is the team lead who sent me the information about the standard operating procedures? Like, what do they need? What is the subject matter experts who are working on the course? Like, what do they need? Like, it was helpful for our conversations, which started by soliciting feedback about how, like, what was working or not working on the team. It was helpful to start from that point of view to say, like, what do people need? What are they frustrated by? What's working and what's not working? And that led us to the process that you described, which is like each week we borrowed the name from early days of Google. We call them snippets. Each person writes their snippets. And then on a team call, we actually read through the snippets together. So we use time synchronously to go through. And the goal of that is not just to read them, but to like ask questions. So like someone gives an update and you're like, "Ooh, that sounds interesting. Can you tell me some more about what was going on with that particular project?" Now that may not work for this organization. I mean, that may not be the right process, but my guess is that everybody in this situation is like, 50% or more correct about what the right thing to do is. And what's missing is there's a reason that team lead was not sharing that information yet. It's not clear that the person who wrote us this note knows what that reason was. And as a result, the decision that they made may or may not align with that. It's also probably true that the person who contacted this listener, who said, "I'm also working in the same area of these things," like the team lead needed to know about that. So like the question is, how do you actually connect the dots? Like, what's a healthy way for that organization to connect the dots? Because it doesn't sound like an email digest or a Slack channel where everything gets made public. That's probably not gonna work for this organization. And maybe even like a reading out of snippets is too like too much. But maybe what you do have is maybe they have a staff meeting and there's like an important, projects announcement or update or something some formalized channel for communicating these things synchronously so that people actually take note of them might help.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, to sort of go back to the theme here about pausing and reflecting and making sure that information is being shared but not overshared, because it can be overly burdensome. If each of us needed to know everything else that each of the other, we couldn't get anything done on it. uh
Yep.
and so one of the things that I found, and I was with a small team, I think what's going on makes a lot of sense. But once the team got bigger, what I would do with my team is I would have an asynchronous moment in my because I tried to do snippets outside of the meeting and then nobody did them. And then I tried to have the conversation in the meeting, but the team was big enough that it went on forever. And so I would say, okay, we're going to have 10 minutes and everybody's going to write their snippets in 5 and read other people's snippets in 5. And if you want to have a conversation about somebody else's snippets, it's going to happen outside this meeting. We're not going to, because what would happen once teams get bigger, what would invariably happen is that there would be 8 people in the room, and 3 of them would be very interested in their conversation. And the other 5 are sitting there like, this is wasting my time. And so having that level of discourse was interesting. And then the other thing, we've talked about big decisions a bunch, but the other thing that happens in meetings is that people feel excluded from decisions. And so that was why we would decide at my staff meeting, like what the big decisions were. We would publish that out to the organization, and then everybody would know what they were. And pretty soon people were like, oh, I don't need to like participate in this. Amen. And then it was sort of self-correcting with a little bit more, openness. But again, that doesn't work for all organizations.
Yeah. So if I was in this person's shoes and like they've already done some pausing and reflecting and said like that, I'd like this not to this not to happen again. I think since they already they already admitted to making these mistakes, I think a really interesting like place to start would be to go to the team lead in each of these cases and solicit some feedback and
Yes.
say and say, hey, I realize that I'm probably not it's always a good time to solicit feedback when you're not the person's favorite person.
Yes.
Yeah, I realize I'm not your favorite person right now, and I kind of like, mess this up a bit. And I want to better understand from you, like, how it is that I can help make sure that we're communicating the right things to the right people at the right time. And I think by starting by soliciting that feedback, you create a channel where you could offer as a suggestion, like, or you could ask the question, like, is there a way for me to connect people with you? Is there a good way for me to connect people with you when you're working in the same area, for example? Like, how should I think about that? By getting advice from these people, you have an opportunity to open a line of communication. Because my guess is that implicit in here is like this person is probably, whether intentionally or not, like push the organization to communicate a bit more openly about things. And I think if you start by admitting the mistake and asking them how you can be most helpful, that gives you a basis to then go back to that person at some point in the future and say, I have an idea for how we could make this better. And now you understand their needs. So the idea that you propose to them can be framed in a way that is actually helpful to them as opposed to feeling threatening.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think also another thing that could happen when soliciting feedback. So now I'm going to try to take the side of the person who decided not to communicate to the SMEs. Like
Yep.
maybe this was a very touchy, like a very delicate situation, and the person wanted to take the time to communicate this in person, or maybe they wanted to spend the time crafting an email that explained all the rationale, and they didn't want to just say, I canceled it, and uh, tough shit, and so maybe that was what was going on. Or maybe, and this happens all the time where where you don't want to tell people that you've canceled their project because it's a form of ruinous empathy. I didn't want to tell them because I know they'd be upset, but like, of course, they're going to be more upset the longer you wait to tell them. But you can learn what's going on. When you solicit feedback, you can learn, maybe what you did wrong, or you give the person the opportunity to explain to you what was going on in their mind.
Yeah.
Because to your point, Kim, I think the implication of what you're saying is you might actually agree with them. Like it might, it might not just be that, oh, I overstepped my bounds, but maybe you actually learned something about why the approach you took was wrong. And why the approach that they were going to take was more correct.
Would have been better. Yeah.
What's coming up for me is in the same way, Kim, that you have the get shit done wheel and really this process of how decisions are made. In many ways, it feels like around communication, it's important as an organization, as a team, to have an understanding of, does this person need to be, informed sort of after? Are they part of the decision? So even being clear, and I know, Jason, this is something we've also talked about as a team, like where people informed in the process. And you'll often say like, okay, I'd love to get your feedback on XYZ. I'm going to be responding. So it's not necessary, but if you want to do it by this time. Or you will loop people in, and it's a little bit like speak now or forever hold your peace. But there's this idea of, are we in the, sort of brainstorming, collaborating, decision-making mode, or are we actually in the, we've made the decision and now we're implementation mode? And so in some ways, I feel like maybe, especially with this incident too, that might be part of the issue as well. Like maybe this person is actually still collecting some feedback or wanting to, implement it by having one-on-one conversations. And we're not actually clear on that. So to your point, Jason, I think by soliciting feedback, we might actually help move this organization to get more clear on, these are the things you can take the ball and run with it. And these are actually more collaborative decisions that we want to make sure we're all agreed on before we start communicating outwards.
Also, in a secretive in a more in a less open environment, an environment where there's more secrets, or more, less prompt. Secretive sounds like the wrong word. I can't think of the right.
It sounds like a judgment, but what you mean is like when the bias is to not share information.
Yes, exactly. Here was some advice that I got when I got to Apple, which was very different kind of. There's category 1, category 2, category 3. Category 1 is your job. You get to make the decisions. Nobody else gets to tell you what to do, including your boss. Category 2 are the things where you need input from others and they need input for you. There's more of a collaborative space. And category 3 are the things that are somebody else's category 1, where you are neither invited nor allowed to interfere. And I think at Google there almost was no category 3. And at Apple, there was a big category 3. And it was very helpful for me to think about, okay, what's my category 1? What's my category 2? And what's my category 3? And once you kind of figured that out, then it was liberating in some ways.
If I had to guess, I feel like that's the key. That's the key piece of advice that we could give this person. Is like that's a really helpful frame, because it's a non-judgmental way to talk about to frame a conversation about what information needs to be shared when, without making about secrets and transparency and openness versus close. It's more like there's certain information that people absolutely need in order to be able to do their job, the category 1 information. There's some information that a person needs to share in order for other people to do their job. And then there's this other category of information that people, don't have an expectation not only to give input into, but they don't have an expectation to know about, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't need to know about everybody else. Like your category 3, you may not know everything that's going on there, and that's totally fine. So I like that. I think that's a super helpful frame for this person. Yeah, because I think if I found myself in a situation at this point in my career, I would find it very frustrating. Like if I was in the person who wrote to us, if I was in their shoes and I saw a bunch of people working on something that I knew had been canceled, like it would be very frustrating I would be tempted to make the same mistake that this person made. And so I just want to
thinking you're doing a favor, thinking you're being a useful information router, and instead you're throwing sand in the gears.
Yep, exactly.
I really appreciate you mentioning that, Kim, because I just want to acknowledge for the listener, like my assumption, their intention is to be helpful to the people
Yeah.
they're trying to communicate. They don't want them wasting their time and all of that. And I can certainly say, and I won't speak for all of you, but I've certainly been in situations where you think you're doing something that's helpful, but you might not have the full view, and it actually doesn't land as helpful for other people. And so I think just going back to that frame of category 1, 2, and 3, at least that can give you some some guardrails about, like, is what I'm sharing helpful because it's a category 1 and I have like full visibility into it.
Yeah, or
Or
it's a
not.
legitimate category too. Like, but I think it probably wasn't this person's job to communicate this. So it's awesome to have initiative, but make sure you know where your initiative is invited and where it's not.
Yeah, and I'm sort of like, the other thing is we don't have the other side of the story here. Like, it's possible that from incident 1, which is the standard operating procedure kerfuffle, that the team lead doesn't. Not only they don't that do they not mind, maybe they're grateful that
Yes.
the person found out about this.
Yeah. Another
Like,
good reason to solicit feedback. You may think you're going to get criticism and you may get praise.
right. So I think that's why it's so important to like have this conversation, because the way they describe it, it sounds like they talked to the person that they let the beans slip to and said, "Hey, don't tell anybody that I told you this."
Yeah.
As opposed to telling the team lead, "Hey, I screwed up and I accidentally shared this information."
Yeah.
Without realizing it should have been kept private for the time being.
But I think in the second case, the listener who wrote in did exactly the right thing. They communicated, they gave bad news early. They went
Yeah.
right to the TL and they said the team leader and they said what they had done, and that has got to earn, I hope that earned some appreciation for them, because I think one of the most important things you can do when you realize you've made a mistake is to be open about it, to tell people.
In some ways, like, I'll admit that, like, I had this biased thought as I was reading this, which is there's a tendency for two things to go hand in hand: closely guarding information and hiding mistakes.
Yes. Yes.
It's not true in every organization, right? Because there's sometimes sometimes guarding information, there's an actual it's fit to purpose. Like, it actually solves a problem. Like, guarding information and keeping information separated solves a real problem that the organization has. I can think of like certain research organizations where they don't actually want some teams to talk to each other, because the whole idea is that they're operating independently from one another and developing ideas on their own. They're not influenced by each other. So that's like a concrete example of where that it solves a particular problem. And by crossing that boundary, you actually, to your point, Kim, you throw sand in the gears, you cause a problem. But I also think, like, it's not necessarily the case that in an organization that has reasons for keeping information separate, that they're not also forthright about mistakes. But I had I'll just admit that, like, I was imagining, I was developing a picture of the organization that this person was describing in my mind, and I was like, "Ooh, they might get punished for admitting to the, you know what I'm saying, for admitting to the mistake that they made." But they didn't say that. They didn't say they got punished. So I think you're exactly right. Like, it's the right thing to do. You shared the mistake. Hopefully, you're offered, you get some credit for being transparent about it, and maybe it's has the potential to be a relationship building moment.
The last thing I'll bring in, a nuance that leapt out at me on that same incident too. I just want to go back, roll back the tape a little bit. And this, person is working with their former TL, wrapping up a course project. They checked the chat. They found out the course was canceled from the team lead. And since the SMEs were expecting to review it next week, they offered to help communicate this. No one replied, so they drafted their own email. 3.5 hours later, the TL responded saying we shouldn't inform. And so I feel like what's missing in this is that this person actually sent the email. Like, they didn't say that they sent it, but I think the email was sent. They said, it drafted my own email, including the phrase, that was the due to a new department direction, this project is canceled. 3.5 hours later, the TL responded saying we shouldn't inform them and separately requested that I forward her my email. So it's not 100% clear to me from the writing that the email was sent, but that's the assumption that I made. And the reason why I want to get granular on that is that sometimes, again, we had a podcast, and we can put this in the show notes, where we talked about kind of communication norms, and is it email, and is it Slack, and is it 24 hours, and is it 48 hours? And we know how much Brandy doesn't like email, et cetera. But I mention it because, Jason, sometimes I will put in Slack, like, this is what I'm sending to X. I'm going to send it by Y, a little bit, speak now, forever hold your peace. And so, like, that has seemed to work for us. I'd love to get your perspective on that. But I think that's the part that is a little bit unclear from the note, giving that person the chance to kind of weigh in.
Since we don't know everything that's going on in this organization, maybe it'd be helpful just to talk about something we do know about, what happens in our company.
Yeah.
And I actually think that, like, it is important. We have had conversations about this, and we have established as a norm that each individual in this organization is empowered to do their job. And to the extent that they need input from somebody else, that they seek that input. But if that input will not arrive by the time that the person is required to do the task, that person is empowered to move forward. That it's incumbent on us, to the people whose input is being requested, to like make the time and to object. And so if the person, it's not like, Amy, if you sent that and I said, hey, I don't have time to review this. Can we hold off on sending it for 2 days because I need time to actually think about what's being written here? Like, that's totally fine. But what's not, I think what in our organization, what we've said is we're not going to throw sort of sand in the gears. We're not going to hold things up based for approval. But that is what works for us. Like that's a conscious choice. That's something that works for our organization. Not every organization is comfortable with that because there's risk inherent in that, right? There's a risk that I disagree, and I just didn't have a chance to look at it, but I disagree with what was done there. And the question is, like, what do you do about that? And so some organizations are unwilling to take that kind of risk. I tend to believe that when you build a team of people who you trust, those kinds of risks are often worth taking. And they're worth taking for a very particular reason, which is when you have the opposite bias, when everything needs to be approved by somebody else, by a manager or somebody else, by definition, narrow the solution set to the things that person thinks is good. And that, to me, negates
that person has time to look at.
To review.
You create bottlenecks.
Exactly. And you negate creativity. You negate it directly undermines the fact, at least in my mind, a fact, which is that people who are thinking deeply about a problem are likely to come up with interesting and novel solutions that you may not have ever thought of. And so you may never have approved because you'd be like, well, that's not the way that I would approach it. And so therefore I'm going to squash that particular idea. But that's our bias as an organization. And I think what's missing here is this person doesn't understand those guidelines for this company. They can't articulate, or they didn't articulate in this note, like, this is the way that we think about information sharing, or this is the way we think about decision making, or this is the way we think about autonomous, doing work autonomously. And because that's unclear, it's really hard for them to choose the right thing to do. Even though I would say, even absent that, there are maybe some opportunities to slow down and choose a different course.
I think that when I have made mistakes, I have a bias to yes, and a bias to action, and a bias to tell everybody everything all the time. So those are my. And when I have made really big mistakes, what happens for me is I send someone an email, and I need some information, and they don't happen to send me the answer I need right away. And I'm afraid I'll forget to do the thing if I don't do it right away. So I just go ahead and do it. It's like, it's a way of scratching it off my list. And that has gotten me into a lot of trouble over the years. Also, it's worth examining, like, part of the reason why I have a bias to yes is because I don't want to remember it. I want to take it off my list. And that can be a problem for the people around me. That can make me a frustrating person. I see some laughter in that. You all have no
Yeah,
doubt observed this, and I really have tried not to do that to the people around me because I don't want to create stress for folks.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the reason why I was describing our biases is because not because they're perfect and because they don't cause problems, but because they cause the problems that I'd prefer to have.
Yeah.
That's really what it boils down to. I don't think there's any set of norms around communication that solve communication, because if there was, we would know what that is.
Yeah,
like
we
someone
would be doing them.
and so instead you have to decide like what are your preferred problems. If you can explain that to people, it allows them to make good choices that help push the organization and their work in a direction that is likely to cause, hopefully minimally disruptive, but also likely to cause problems in the direction that you want to deal with. And the reason why that matters is because I feel like as an organization, like another way to frame this is like some organizations want to be very proactive, meaning they want to plan out every single step that they're going to take, and they want to have a plan for every contingency. And that's just the way that's the way that they think about their work. And that's the way they've structured the organization. So they've like built the team around this ability to like proactively see around corners and plan everything out. And if they got into reactive mode, the whole thing would come crashing down. The whole house of cards would come tumbling down because they haven't built the team to like respond agilely to problems that they hadn't anticipated, but instead they built a team to anticipate all the problems and work around them. And so it is hard. Like it's not just about communication preferences. It's like, how have you structured the organization to solve the kinds of problems that your organizational structure causes?
Well, yeah, and it also depends on like what you're working on. Like we are not managing a nuclear power plant. If we were,
Or yeah,
I would
medical
not have
devices or anything.
I
Yeah.
would, then I would have all kinds of checklists and approvals, and I would like it would be totally terrifying to operate the way we operate if we were flying an airplane or doing something like
Agreed.
that.
And I think I just want to name, because I think this is something that people can do and teams can do. Jason, what you were saying about, being really clear that we have a bias for these are the kinds of problems we'd prefer to solve for. I think that's another thing that came up out of our speak truth to power conversations that we were having, where we were looking at how things can improve. And at least for me, coming from organizations where I've overseen communications in much more hierarchical, bureaucratic, where the stakes were quite high with communication. It was very helpful for me to hear that, because that goes against some of the ways in which I've been in organizations or sort of raised up in different organizations. So I think being really clear about this is our bias or this is how we think about things can give people permission and just make it much, much clearer for people. Brandy, you said, if you say yes, how do you remember you said yes? I didn't know if you wanted to.
Oh, yeah, no, but I was just going to say, I think I don't know what this person's background is, but I have ADHD, and impulsivity and oversharing are two symptoms, especially of the kind that I have. So like my bias is also to tell everybody everything and also to impulsively do the thing right away. And so I think just knowing that about yourself and like how you can rein yourself in. And then when I feel very disorganized, I want more structure, because like Kim, what you said, like I'll just forget about the thing, or I don't have an organization list. It's called like leaving my email unread. So it's knowing what works best for the individual people, like you yourself, knowing what kind of organization you're going to be able to function in is important as well.
I think it's great.
Totally agree. Yeah.
All right. Now it's time for our Radical Candor checklist. Tips to start putting radical candor into practice now. Tip number 1, pause and review. Before responding to messages or sending out emails, take a moment to pause, review the content carefully. This helps ensure you fully understand any confidentiality requests or specific instructions. Something I often do as well is I will put a message, I will get rid of the to from, and I will write my draft and I will have it there just so that I can read it through again. And I really try to think about how is it going to land for these different people. So both pausing and reviewing on reading what's being sent to me, but then also reviewing before I send it out.
Tip number 2, clarify expectations. If you receive a message that seems ambiguous or doesn't clearly state whether the information is confidential, don't hesitate to ask for clarification. A simple just to confirm, is this information okay to share with others, can prevent misunderstandings.
I feel like building on that, and if you feel like it would be useful to share the information with others, clarifying that it actually must be kept confidential is useful too, to say, I have someone who might benefit from hearing this information or reading this information. Would it be okay to share with them is another great way to clarify.
Yes, absolutely.
Tip number 3, communicate your intentions. In situations where you need to share information, communicate your intentions clearly and ask for feedback about what you intend to do. For example, something like, I plan to inform the subject matter experts about the course cancellation. Is there anything specific I should or shouldn't mention? And, giving the person who you're asking for feedback some time to respond to that before you before you get overeager and hit the send button. So give them time to actually give you the feedback that you're asking for.
Tip number 4, don't be too fast to hit send. This was one of the best bits of feedback I ever got is if it feels too good to hit send, don't hit send.
We might have to put that one on repeat for you, Kim. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, for more tips, check out our YouTube channel. You can not only listen to this podcast, but also watch dozens of other Radical Candor videos. Show notes for this episode are at radicalcandor.com/podcast. Praise in public, criticize in private. So if you like what you hear, we hope you do. Please follow, rate, review us wherever you listen to podcasts. It really does help. If you have criticism for us or stories you'd like to share, email it podcast@radicalcandor.com. We read everyone. Thank you again for this listener for sharing their desires to grow. Already so much self-awareness there. Thank you again for helping all of us get better. Bye for now.
Take care.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.